We've got more new Death Knight cards to review this time around, taking a look at a lot of Unholy cards, kicking it off with a new legendary spell, the Scourge, a 9-mana double Unholy rune card, shadow spell. Fill your board with random undead. So Unholy Death Knights in general look like they're going to be about swarming the board with lots of stuff, just throwing undead minions, throwing bodies at the opponent turn after turn. So wide board token style plays, often having some board buffs and damage follow-ups, and this essentially caps all that off with one last ditch effort, I think, to build a gigantic board and hope that you've exhausted your opponent's resources, exhausted the removal, and that the Scourge in one way or another will stick, allowing you to secure a lethal, or maybe just expecting one more big board to die leading into your turn 10 Denathrius, because this sure seems like an archetype that's going to lead really well into Denathrius and infused minions in particular. Now, when it comes to filling the board with random undead, I mean, we've got this new minion type. You may be curious what undead minions look like on average. It may be hard to get a good idea of this. There are also lots of new ones. There are some big boys. There are things like the Abominable Lieutenant. There are some 8/8s like Kel'Thuzad and Mordresh, and a new 8/8 we're going to talk about here in a minute, but also lots of small stuff, right? You've got lots of little early game minions, a lot of fodder, even stuff that's 5-drops like the Bootstrap Sunken Ear. Sunken Ear is not going to feel great as a 4/4 necessarily. I mean, it's fine if you get a few 4/4s, you're not going to be too upset, but they're not going to be like the stars of the show. But these, like, big 8/8s, no Muncher will feel pretty good. Taunt and Lifesteal, that's some nice keywords to use. Some Reborn stuff might add to the stickiness of the board. That could definitely help to make it feel better. Some crazy high rolls like Lady Death Whisper if you happen to have any frost spells. Perhaps not that likely, but so I think the takeaway here is a lot of little things on average, a few potentially big punchy cards with cool effects like the Sin Runners, the Abominable Lieutenants. There's a preview of another card incoming. So Undying Disciple would be a pretty good high roll, I bet, to give you some defensive utility. So on average, I would say expect a few 2/2s, maybe 3 or 4 2/2s, maybe a couple like 4/4 size minions, and maybe 1 or 2 of the bigger 8/8s, big powerful effect cards like the Lieutenant or the Sin Runner. So a mix. Occasionally you'll high roll, sometimes you'll low roll super hard too and just get a bunch of 2/2s. You'll have a little bit of survivability off Reborn, I think, from time to time. So it won't be the stickiest board, but it'll be a big board. And the question is, does that work well? I'm a little sad that I don't think it will work especially well. I have a feeling that this style of play will have a really nice, high pressure token game plan up through the mid game, turn 5, turn 6. And then I think there might be a little bit of a gap where it's hard for this to really keep reloading turn after turn after turn. I don't know that the cards will have enough oomph or enough like per card value to keep up all the way through turn 9 with this high pressure situation. So the Scourge may not feel like a continuation so much as like a little bit of a gap, and then your opponent's had a little time to recover or stabilize the board, and you're playing this, but it's not really while you're ahead, it's while you're perhaps equal or even behind on board, and then it's going to feel like the Scourge is less powerful. So really the only angle I see is just more stuff leading into Denathrius, more bodies, more corpses for maybe another quick reload after this if you have some cards that needed some extra corpses. So I do think it's going to come along a little late. If you could cheat this out faster, of course, if you have spell discounts in some way or another, getting this down on turn 7 or something would I think help fill that curve a lot more nicely. I feel like that would really be the time for this card to succeed. By the time you get around to turn 9, a little bit harder to work with, but still, big board dumps like this, sometimes they just stick and sometimes they just work, and that's enough. And there are so many big board potentials in Unholy Death Knights. Maybe this is fine. So ultimately, looks really fun, looks okay, but I just don't think it's going to be like the star of this deck. So moving on to the Stitched Giant, a new 10-mana 8/8 undead. Certainly be a good roll off the Scourge. This one costs 1 less for each corpse you've spent this game. So of course, corpses you're getting when things die. Getting corpses, I think, is going to be really easy for Unholy Death Knights. Spending corpses looks like it's going to be a little bit tougher, because basically every card, or almost every card you play, is going to help you contribute to getting corpses, because any minion's going to give you corpses. But there are a select few and not as many reliable corpse spending cards. We're going to talk about a few certainly in this video. They often are spending, 2, 3, 4 corpses. So it may only take a couple to get the Stitch Giant to feel like he's in a really good spot. I think obviously you get this down to 4 or 3 mana, it starts to look pretty exciting. So you might need to spend 6 corpses or so for this card to feel really good. I think most of your corpse spinning is going to happen in the mid game based on the Unholy cards we've seen so far, kind of those turn 3, turn 4, turn 5 regions for spinning your corpses, which means this is probably a card that's coming down on turn 5, turn 6, turn 7, which it is the stage of the game where the stat totals of just an 8/8 dump matter less and less, but are still relevant, of course. If you throw this down with a bunch of other smaller minions, you're kind of staggering your threats. Your opponent has to both deal with a wide board of little stuff and then one really tall thing. That can be really frustrating for sometimes for opponents to get both taken care of, and they might just leave behind one or the other, and suddenly you're hitting them for 8s or getting a nice swarm board that's getting buffed and killing them if they decide to focus on the giant. So I think it is nice to have a threat for this deck that alternates the plan a little bit, that shifts gears. I'm making something big and tall now. Now you've got a secondary problem to deal with. If you were really good at answering my swarms, maybe this thing will stick and connect. So that said, I think, again, this is pretty solid. I will say, of course, any cards that get costed discounted, anything that can go to 0 has historically proven very good in Hearthstone. So cards like this, I think you always have to keep an eye on. I'm still want to see more corpse spinning stuff, not even just like in this set, but in the future as well. Of course, this card's gonna be around presumably for a while. We don't know for sure, but I think it might need a little more than we're seeing right now as far as corpse spinning is concerned to feel great, but the potential is definitely still there for a very powerful card. So here's a way to get corpses, and I think a big one too, by the way. Plagued Grain, a new triple Unholy rune, 1 mana spell. This will gain you 4 corpses, and it will shuffle 4 crates into your deck that summon a 2/2 undead when drawn. So this is an immediate way to get some corpses to spend, and we're gonna see even some turn 2 corpse payoff cards, where this one might really immediately be worth it. You're gonna want those corpses pretty quickly to get things moving. So although, I do think a lot of decks would prefer to have a 1 mana minion down on turn 1 to start gaining that tempo immediately, I think with a swarm deck, a deck that goes really wide on board, sometimes you're happy to give up a couple early turns of tempo as long as you're able to build those big threat boards in the mid game. If you're hitting wide boards on turn 3 and 4 and 5, often that's really where you're hitting your power band in the deck. You don't need necessarily to curve out perfectly 1/2. So in other words, sacrificing a little tempo to set up corpses, to set up those better mid-game swing turns and board dumps in the mid-game is probably going to feel fine. So I think Plague Grain actually fits rather nicely in that regard. You've also got this upside here, of course, of these crates in the deck, which just very occasionally will get you a bonus 2/2. And that's nice to get an extra minion on board, an extra little sticky thing. That's extra corpses also feeding into things. I don't know how much card draw you're going to have in Unholy Death Knight. It doesn't look like a lot, particularly because this is a triple rune card, so that means you're not going to get any complementary runes. So you're going to have to utilize Unholy Death Knight's card draw, or neutral, of course, to make the things come out faster. So they may not feel like they're coming often, but even just very occasionally that extra 2/2 win. I think the majority of the upside of this card are the corpses itself. I think the 2/2s are going to feel like bonus in a lot of scenarios. So I do think this will be an important engine for triple Unholy decks. Now, as a triple Unholy card, there's always the risk that deck just doesn't make sense, and it's way better off to run 2 Unholy and 1 whatever else, and then Plague Grain will certainly be left aside because you just literally can't run it. So that restriction does introduce a lot of risk for the playability of this card. But if triple Unholy is a thing, I think this card would actually feel like a rather important part of it. Speaking of triple Unholy, we have a pretty crazy card here. This is Grave Strength, a new 4 mana triple Unholy rune shadow spell that gives your minions +1 attack, or you can spend 5 corpses to give them +3 instead. So this is a 4 mana Bloodlust if you're able to spend 5 corpses, and actually even better than Bloodlust because they just get the attack permanently. It's not this turn. So you can use this both as a lethal finisher a la Bloodlust, or you can just use this to get some threatening minions on board that your opponent really has to deal with. They probably already felt a lot of pressure, but suddenly turning these 1/1s or tiny little reborn things into monster threats via Grave Strength creates even more demand for your opponent to deal with these threats right away. And if they don't, they're probably just taking way too much damage. Also, this gives you a little bit of tradability with your small stuff too. If needed, you can use this to take some great trades on board. And spending 5 corpses, as I said, you know, I think a lot of your corpse spinning is going to happen on turns 4, 5, etc. in Unholy Death Knight. So this is a really big discount right away to your giant. The Stitch Giant is going to get 5 cheaper off of Grave Strength alone. So a couple questions. Are you going to have 5 corpses on turn 4? I think, yeah, actually with Plague Grain type cards, yes, I think fairly consistently you will. Are you going to have a board left on turn 4 though, where this is going to line up well? That's a little shakier for me. Because, you know, I think you're going to be wanting to spend your mana to build the board in the mid game. So maybe this is coming down later, turn 5, turn 6, after a board has managed to stick and there's some value in Grave Strength, maybe even later once you're just finally getting ready to kill your opponent. So in those scenarios, where it is coming down a little later, not right away, that's not as likely to discount your Stitch Giant in a relevant time frame. It may be that the Stitch Giant gets discounted too late because you're using this as an in-game finisher. So I don't know if the bonus of discounting your Stitch Giant is as relevant as we'd perhaps like for the Grave Strength. It may have to rely more on its own strength, which, that said, I think it has a lot. Bloodlust has been a great way to finish. We like lethality in Hearthstone. It's important to be able to kill people, and knowing that this exists as a threat makes every single board in Unholy Death Knight a really scary one, assuming that they are triple rune Death Knight. So I think this card looks really good. Basically, like, man, this is a great finisher, has upside on corpses. I don't think it's going to be hard to achieve that condition, and occasionally will buff your Stitch Giants too. So all in all, really, really powerful finisher tool. I guess I should say, at a base level, not as exciting, but sometimes you'll use it anyway. I think sometimes you'll just need that +1 and that's enough, and you don't care about the corpses, but very often I think you'll have lots and lots of corpses in Unholy Death Knight. So next up here we have Unholy Frenzy, a new 3-mana single Unholy Rune spell. This one allows you to choose an enemy minion, your minions attack it, and then you resummon any that die. So this is kind of like a Devouring Swarm for Hunter, but instead of getting the cards back in hand with Devouring Swarm, in this case you get them immediately right back on board. And that's pretty nifty, and again fits the swarming and corpse building goals of an Unholy Death Knight, I think, really nicely. You're going to have some boards laying around, you need to clear something up, you want to feed your corpse pile, and you want to make sure you have a board left behind. That's awesome. And then with like Reborn or Death Rattles, you might sometimes even kind of double up on effects. As a single rune card, you can run this with the like new Thalassian guy, Thracian, the new 4-mana guys. I'm trying to pull up his art here. You can run this with like Thessarian, that's his name. You know, and like imagine this, right? This trades in all these like death rattles are going off. You're getting a reborn Thessarian, you're getting a new fresh Thessarian. That starts to look pretty crazy, right? There's some minions clearly where the upside on killing them off is really, really high. And I think this just fits so naturally into the Death Knight game plan. Also just allows you to actually like have, you know, bum minions that are just not doing much, just, you know, stat bodies on board, those like 2/2s or something off the grain piles, just random garbage that's, you know, you're playing out right now. Giving it immediate reactivity sometimes can be really helpful, because if it doesn't have rush or some way to react to your opponent's plays at all, this can just give you a way to make sure you're not falling too far behind, keeping up with your opponent's threats while also still developing your game plan. So I think this card looks really nice. I think this will be a nifty tool for Death Knights for sure. Moving on here to the Pacifier, a 5-mana 3/3 single Unholy Rune card. Battlecry summon 2 1/1 fighters with Rush and Reborn. So in total there, you're getting basically 5 minions off of this one, and you're also getting 4 damage in immediate rush reactivity, so you can trade in these 1/1s to clean up a little thing of your opponents or 2. While also, of course, again, piling up your corpses with 5 total bodies here on the Pacifier. That offers this card some nice mid-game flexibility, because you can play it either reactively or proactively just to get, you know, a wider board of your own, just summoning 3 things and making sure your opponent has to deal with those reborn aspects. Anything left behind becomes a huge threat with Grave Strength, etc. I will say, you know, 5 mana is getting a little more expensive for this type of card. I think it's fine. I think it's pretty solid. I suspect for now the Death Knights will play this. I think they just need cards and they don't have a lot of cards. So I think an Unholy Death Knight deck will probably run this. They do, I think, want to extend their board builders into the mid game, turn 5, turn 6, etc. So Possessifier here might be one of the only options that they have right now. This could be the kind of card where I think its strength is low enough that it might fall off in future expansions as Death Knight gets more stuff to work with, as their game plan gets more refined, as they get more ways to build boards. I don't know necessarily that the Possessifier will keep up. I think, you know, this having that flexibility to be both reactive and a board builder is nice for now, but I suspect we'll get more refined game plans, things that are looking to do like a more specific, just I want the most threatening board I can get right away. The option to trade in is not something I value necessarily. So we could see this, you know, fall off in the future, but for now, I think solid, just not the craziest highest power level card we've seen. Moving on to the Bone Digger Geist here, a 2-mana 2/2 undead, single unholy rune. Battlecry, spin a corpse to gain +1/+2. So that makes this a 3/4 if you spin a corpse. So next up here is the Bone Digger Geist, a 2-mana 2/2 undead with a single unholy rune, and Battlecry, spin a corpse to gain +1/+2. So if you have a corpse when you play this, this is going to be a 3/4. I think if you play a 1-mana minion on turn 1, you won't always have a corpse because it may not actually die off in time for the Bone Digger Geist, but sometimes you might, and then you get a nice 3/4, kind of like Totem Golem of old, but no overload to punish you. But you also have your Grain card now. That just gives you a bunch of corpses to start working with, and I think this makes a really nice catch-up card on turn 2 right away to make sure that you're getting some bodies down and advancing your tempo here off the Bone Digger Geist. I think 2-mana 3/4 is still pretty relevant in modern day Hearthstone, honestly, even though it's just stats. That's so good to get down early and start building off of. Helps you take a couple early trades into an opponent 3/3 or something, kill a couple minions, go 2 for 1, and just make sure that you're staying ahead on board off the back of this early start with the guys. So I think this looks pretty good. You know, if you don't have the corpse and you want to play this on turn 2, yes, you're not thrilled to play a 2/2. I also don't think it's a total disaster, though. Just getting bodies down and keeping the corpse train rolling will still be relevant. So sometimes it's going to feel great as a 3/4. Sometimes it's going to feel disappointing, but okay as a 2/2. And then other times you might just be able to hold it because you have another play, maybe even just a Hero Power's fine on turn 2. And you weave this in on turn 4, turn 5. The stats are still going to be relevant through the mid game. So ultimately, yeah, I think the Bone Digger Geist looks pretty solid. Next up is the Ymir Jar Deathbringer, a 3-mana 3/3 double unholy rune undead minion. It has Taunt and Death Rattle. Spend 3 corpses to summon a 3/3 Risen Ymir Jar with Taunt. Remember, a reminder here, Risen minions do not contribute to your corpse totals. But in this case, you've got a potential here for 2 3/3s, both of them with Taunt. Now, this is on a Death Rattle, so that's a 3/3 that's a little bit delayed. It also does demand 3 corpses, which honestly by turn 3 is still pretty hefty. I mean, yes, we saw the Grain. Yes, it's certainly possible to still have 3 by turn 3, but I think that's a fairly expensive corpse check for this point in the game. I will also say that the body being on the Death Rattle here makes me a little nervous for the Ymir Jar. We've had sort of the double agent and rogue that's playing a couple 3/3s on turn 3. And I felt like it was always fairly important that those came down simultaneously. Like, you wanted that immediate tempo and you wanted multiple bodies right away. The delay here does make me a hair more nervous. So is the Taunt upside here worth it to make up for that fact? It's a bonus, but I'm not in love with this one. Now, spending corpses does discount your giant, so maybe, this is an important way to get some discounts on that giant ASAP. This alone, though, only makes your giant 7 mana, so you still have to do a lot more to get the giant down to a playable state. So I feel like this is just in an awkward spot. You want to spend corpses, but this is maybe a little too many, a little too early. So I think this might actually feel kind of clunky and a little bit delayed for a card that probably wants to encourage a lot more tempo than it really is. It's not bad if you're like trading it off because you got that Death Rattle, and resummoning it and stuff. Like, okay, that's extra ways to get bodies, but even then, you're gonna run out of corpses, I think, pretty quickly. So again, just a little early for that corpse check is my instinct on this one. So next up here we have the Nerubian Swarm Guard, a 4-mana 1/3 single unholy rune undead minion. It's got Taunt, and Battlecry summon 2 copies of this minion. And I like this one a lot because you're going wide immediately. Unlike our previous card, you're getting 3 taunts. So at a base level, I honestly think this card's pretty interesting alone. It doesn't need much to support it. because it's just like really frustrating for some decks to deal with. Like, these 3 health is awkward breakpoint. Like, I got to trade in a bunch of stuff weirdly into these Swarm Guards. Just one of those high friction plays that really does lock down a board. Kind of a mini spreading plague, if you will. And then with this summon 2 copies thing, anytime you start to hand buff a card like this or buff on board, man, those copies get a lot of extra value. We've seen this copy effect work so well historically in Hearthstone, and getting 2 copies in particular feels like a lot of upside for the Nerubian Swarm Guard. So multiple bodies, super wide board for tokens, a lot of like buff upside potential as well for the Swarm Guard. So I think this actually looks really nice. I think this will be a staple card you're very excited to play on turn 4 very often in an Unholy Death Knight deck. And maybe even beyond that, if you're just splashing a single rune Unholy, I could see some other decks using this one well too. Next up is the Tomb Guardians. I'm pretty sure these zombies are doing the Thriller Dance, which is amazing. It's a 4-mana spell, double Unholy Rune, Shadow. You summon 2/2/2 zombies with Taunt, and if you spin 4 corpses, if you have 4 corpses to spend, you don't get an option. You have to spend them if you have them. You can give those zombies Reborn. So 4 bodies in total here for 4 mana. Some of them on the back end there with the delay with the Reborn. And those Reborn, of course, are 2/1s. So 2/2/2s and 2/2/1s. They do all have Taunt. So, again, a little bit disruptive. I will say, though, comparing these 2 cards straight up, I like the Nerubian Swarm Guard so much more. The bodies are immediate. The health totals are higher and harder to deal with. You don't have to spin corpses to get the upside, so it's always going to work, whereas sometimes Tomb Guardians, you may not have the corpses, and it feels like this just doesn't work. Now, again, of course, spinning corpses can be good with a giant, but you're not always going to have a giant in hand, and even then, this is still just a 4-mana discount. Now, that said, with the turn 3 Ymir Jar and the turn 4 Tomb Guardians, that is suddenly 7 mana in discounts on the giant, which means, okay, maybe the giant's coming down on turn 5. That feels pretty good, but how consistently are you going to hit that? I do think this feels like one of the weaker board building options for one reason or another. It's a lot of bodies for 4 mana, but only sometimes, and they're certainly weaker bodies, I think, than most. So for me, Tomb Guardians doesn't look quite as powerful. So to shift gears here a little bit, we actually got some other Death Knight cards revealed that are Unholy that are a part of the expansion set, not the core or Path of Arthas Death Knight cards. These are actually from March of the Lich King, because of course Death Knight's getting 10 cards in March of the Lich King like everybody else. Now, that said, I'm going to be a real stickler here. I'm going to save my full reviews for these in a March of the Lich King card review video. I like keeping them separate, for record keeping sake, just for my own silly anal tendencies here. So I'm going to talk about these, show you these real quick, but I'm going to save the full review for the next March of the Lich King card review, because these are the Death Knight core set and Path of Arthas reviews. Anyway, this is Blightfang, 3-mana single Unholy Rune, 3/3 beast. Battlecry, infect all enemies with Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 zombie with Taunt for your opponent. So the idea here is your opponent has a board of 4 minions, you play Blightfang, all of those 4 minions are going to be infected. When they die, you're going to get a 2/2 zombie with Taunt. And it does say enemies, so that theoretically means the opponent's face. Maybe you'll get a bonus 2/2 as you win the game. Really, I think enemies is here because this text box is very full, and if they had to write enemy minions, it simply would not fit. So they just shortened it to enemies, because who cares? It works the same in every scenario, I think. Basically, you just get a bonus 2/2 at the end of the game. But as regards to this card, pretty cool, right? A great way to get some real upside and punish your opponent for having a board. And, this makes their life a little bit more awkward, trading stuff in. If you kill things, suddenly you've got yourself a nice little board baked in as well. And the Blightfang is not a huge sacrifice to make as a 3-mana 3/3. You don't love it, but if you time it well, man, that's going to be nice. And it probably won't usually actually be on turn 3. It's probably going to come down a little later in the game. At some point, you weave it into a turn, you get your nice counter board. So I think this looks pretty nifty. I like this card a lot. Should be cool. Should be good. There's also the Meat Grinder here, 3-mana 3/4 mech, single Unholy Rune. Battlecry, shred a random minion in your deck to gain 3 corpses. This is another one of the corpse builders, just vanilla stat line, and get some corpses. It's hard for me to envision just how strong these are going to be. Like, how many corpses do you need? Are you going to have enough organically for minion trades, or do you have to weave stuff like this into a turn? I got a feeling organically getting minions is going to feel better most of the time, because you're going to want like the good plays on board as well, and this isn't the greatest of plays on board. It's just Prince Renathal on turn 3, we know is not great. It's okay. So I don't know. Will this be necessary? Will these corpse engines be important or not. Time will tell. There's also the Necrotic Mortician, a 2-mana 2/3 double Unholy Rune battle cry. If a friendly undead died after your last turn, discover an Unholy Rune card. So we've got this undead minion condition check again here, and if it works, you get to discover an Unholy Rune card. Cards like this are always fine, you know. They sometimes pop into Renathal decks. The Reno deck certainly love discover effects like this. Some control decks can run these cheap, like, discover a card things. They're basically little speed bumps you play out, and you get a card that you care about for later. I don't know that you're going to really want that as much in Unholy Death Knight deck. Seems like you're going to really want consistent early game swarms and keeping that minion pressure up, and a 2/3 doesn't really do that all that well. Yeah, it's a corpse, but any other minion you play under 2 would also be a corpse. So is that discover of an Unholy Rune card going to be good enough to help? Is that going to be enough upside? I'm not convinced right now that it will. I think it's going to take a really specific, fairly low synergy sort of deck to care about the Necrotic Mortician. The Scourge is a 3-star card. Stitched Giant is a 4-star card. Plagued Grain is a 4-star card. Grave Strength is a 5-star card. Unholy Frenzy is a 4-star card. Possessifier is a 3-star card. Bone Digger Geist is a 4-star card. Ymir Jar Deathbringer is a 2-star card. Nerubian Swarm Guard is a 4-star card. Tomb Guardians is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. It wraps it up for this particular review. What do you think about these cards? Is the Scourge going to be good enough? It certainly looks really cool. I think this is some old artwork, and it looks amazing. Share your thoughts on all these cards and more down in the comments below. Are you excited to play Unholy Death Knight? I want to hear all of that. But until then, thanks so much for watching. And until next time, game on.